welcome back to the History of Christianity. Last time we looked at the spiritualist and the pietist, and today we are going to be looking at the First Great Awakening. Stay tuned for the power.
Okay, class, we're now going to look at the First Great Awakening. So background, what was the First Great Awakening? You may have heard of it before, you may know some things about it, and we're just going to briefly go through it here in this PowerPoint. But it was an influential evangelical movement in the modern period that occurred in Great Britain and America. So where the Second Great Awakening took place just in America, this takes place in Great Britain and in America. It took place in the first half of the 18th century, so the first half of the 1700s. It was called the First Great Awakening later because obviously there was a second, but it's also known as the Evangelical Revival or the Wesleyan Revival because the Wesley Brothers were involved in it. So what caused the First Great Awakening? Well, first off, any kind of Great Awakening or revival is going to be because of a movement of God. And it actually took place during a low moral and religious ebb. So, you have ebbs and flows, or you could say high and lows. Well, it was a low time morally and religiously. It was just a lot of issues going on in people's lives, obviously morally with sin. But religiously, there was, as we talked previously, as you can see on the screen there with number 2, English Christians were influenced by skeptics, by rationalists, by the deists. So all of these things are taking place and influencing Christianity. So it's kind of a low time religiously. Moral life was low in England, number 3 there on the screen. Number 4, low religious enthusiasm because the monarchs weren't overly religious. And it caused the people to not really care too much about religion. And then number 5, there was industrialization that was taking place, causing a wide class separation. So people, especially if they're in desperate times, they're going to be looking for help. They're going to be looking for guidance. And so they sometimes look towards religion. These 3 guys on the screen, I'm sure you've heard of them before, but they were involved in the First Great Awakening. John Wesley, his brother Charles Wesley, and then George Whitefield. And so there's some pictures there on the screen to kind of identify these guys so we're familiar with them. But we're going to look at them just briefly. The Wesley brothers, you have John Wesley, 1703 to 1791. His brother Charles Wesley, 1707 to 1788. And they're English. And they left England and they became missionaries in Georgia for the Church of England, Georgia, the colony. And it was for the Church of England, but the thing was that they went there, but they weren't even converted. They ended up returning to England, and in 1738 is when they professed personal faith in Jesus Christ. And so John and Charles Wesley, they're going to have a major impact because of founding of Methodism, but they were also Armenian, they had Armenian beliefs. Okay, so next on the scene there is George Whitefield. He was the son of a saloon keeper, and after his conversion, he joined up with the Wesleys, and he was Calvinist. And the reason I bring those up, Armenian Calvinism, is that this is going to cause an issue, and they're going to end up splitting. So John Wesley is looked at as the founder of Methodism, and it was called Methodism after he died, but he's looked at as the founder of Methodism, and all 3 of them came together and formed the leadership of the Methodist movement in England. So George Whitefield, was a preacher and a good preacher, and so he was part of the Methodist movement. Charles Wesley was a songwriter, and then John Wesley was a preacher, and he was actually like the sustainer of the movement. So they all were in the Methodist movement and leadership of the Methodist movement. Well, they went around Britain, they went around Wales, they went around Scotland, holding revivals, and they were actually forming these like Methodist societies that established circuit riding preachers who would travel around, and they were spreading the word of God. They ended up splitting over the theological issue, like I said, of Calvinism and Armenianism. They ended up splitting over that, and Whitefield then went and traveled to America. So in America, the Methodist preachers, the others had gone over to America. It wasn't just Whitefield being the first one. There were others over there, and so Methodism was spreading in America also. When the colonies separated from England during the Revolutionary War, so the Methodists also, they separated, and they created the Methodist Episcopal Church in America, which what you would say is the Methodist Church in America today. Whitefield had gone to America, and he was one of the greatest revival preachers in America. He went around all up and down the colonies preaching, and thousands upon thousands of people came and listened to him and were saved, and he was a great revivalist preacher. And he met up with Jonathan Edwards. So we'll talk about him briefly. Jonathan Edwards, 1703 to 1758. He was a Congregationalist in Northampton, Massachusetts, which was another Christian denomination, and he was educated at Yale. Great revival took place from his preaching. He is well known mainly because of, well, first he was a revivalist, but his one famous sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God was very moving. It basically was, it scared the people that at any moment God, and in God's sovereignty and in basically in his pleasure, if you want to use it that way, that's what Jonathan Edwards said, he could cast somebody into hell. So because the person's a sinner. So there was a very emotional sermon, and many people came to Christ and called on God to be saved, called on Jesus to be saved because of they didn't want to go to hell. He preached to the people's emotions for a response, but it was always with this idea that emotion should never eclipse the conversion. Emotion could move someone to be converted, but it should not be just an emotional undertaking where just somebody's just emotional so they think they're saved. No, it always came to the point of conversion. This is Jonathan Edwards Church in Northampton, Massachusetts. It's been rebuilt because it actually was destroyed by a fire. But the only original feature of the church is the steps from Jonathan Edwards Church. The reason I put that on there is I have been to that church. I've been in that church, and when I went to Mid-America Northeast Campus up there in New York, I was able to go over to Massachusetts and go with a seminary group, and one of my professors stood in the pulpit of that church. We sat in the pews, he stood in the pulpit, and he read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God to us. So pretty neat, I thought. So there's a picture of the church. Okay, so some results of the Great Awakening. New leaders in the Church of England became evangelical. So one of them, a famous one, he's right there on the right of your screen, William Wilberforce, 1759 to 1833. He's the most well-known evangelical Anglican, and he was a leader of the anti-slave movement in England. And so just a person of note. It started a missions movement. Many missionaries came out of this movement. Bible and tract publications came out of the First Great Awakening. So Bibles are being printed, tracts is being moved around and sent around. Established the Methodists. That's a pretty big one there. Numerous conversions. People had focus on personal conversion of the lost, so numerous conversions. Many people were saved. Other evangelicals, such as the Baptists, also benefited. And the reason is that if conversion is based on a personal experience, many Congregationalists who believed in infant baptism, Congregationalists believed in infant baptism, many of them were saying, well, if it's about a personal conversion, well, how can an infant have a personal conversion? And so they had an issue with their own belief. And many of them actually left the Congregationalists and became Baptists. So evangelicals, other denominations benefited from it. And it brought spiritual unity to the colonies. So those were some results of the First Great Awakening. Okay, so that's it for this PowerPoint. I'll see you in a second.
Okay, class, that's it for today. Next time, we're going to continue with the Great Awakening idea, and we're going to look at the Second Great Awakening. Have a great day.